Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You can really help us by pressing subscribe or share it with your friends. Joining me today is Richard Page, an educator, project manager, and marine scientist, all the way from the city of Qingdao in the east coast of China. Hello, Richard, and welcome to Seafood Matters.
Hello, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you. Jim, one of the most amazing things about living in Qingdao is that it's on the eastern peninsula of the Shandong Peninsula, the southeastern part. So it juts all the way out into the space between the Bohai Sea and the Yellow Sea, forming a strategic part of the Pacific Ocean.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful area. It was originally colonized by the Germans, so the majority of the architecture here is quite old and European.
Okay.
There, after the following the Germans, it was colonized by the Russians. Following the Russians, it was colonized by the Japanese, and eventually it was liberated from the Japanese by the Americans. So until 1948, this was the operations command for the U.S. naval forces in Asia.
Wow. I think it has always been part of China, is it?
Of course, of course, Qingdao has always been part of China, and in fact, one of the most unique things about it is that it's one of the most multicultural cities of China. During the what's called the New Republic period of Chinese history, Qingdao was one of the rare places where people were encouraged to assimilate with each other. So a large part of the city was under German colonialism, but the parts of the city that were under Chinese control were encouraged to assimilate with the parts that were German. So you have wonderful cathedrals here, like St. Michael's Cathedral, and you have red tile roofs all across the old town. Um, one of the most striking things is that after the end of World War II, so much of traditional German architecture from the South had been destroyed that the Germans actually sent a team to Qingdao to reconstruct their buildings from here. Qingdao is the 11th largest port in the world by volume. It's the 11th largest trade port in the world. And it is the home of China's fishing powerhouse. So all of the major fishing companies that operate within China have an office here. The majority of the Qingdao companies that operate here have developed a very robust seafood ecosystem for the community with the help of Ocean University of China and the Agricultural University of Qingdao.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that, Richard. Richard, please tell our listeners where life started for you and how your career developed. And you've obviously well traveled. And now you're in China.
Well, first, let me begin by wishing everyone in your audience a Happy New Year. I was born in Delaware in the United States in a fishing community called Lewis. And I spent most of my life in Lewis. When I was a young man, when I was about 13 years old, I had to get special permission to go out and join the Menhaden fishermen, and we would fish the Delaware River. From Delaware, I had the great fortune of studying under some of the luminaries of biology and marine biology there. My mother was one of the founding conservationists of the state, and I studied with people like Bill Seifert and Captain Clyde Roberts and others. And I was the youngest person ever elected to the Coastal Zone Board of Delaware, studying marine fisheries and working with marine fisheries. After I had been landing the Atlantic short-nosed sturgeon and releasing them, of course, because they're endangered in the water of Delaware. I wrote a comprehensive study on the Atlantic short-nosed sturgeon that became part of a class that I would offer to fishermen and to conservationists alike. So I began very humbly working as a cabin boy on a fishing boat at 13 years old. And then I worked my way to become a fisherman and a hauler and a net caster, and then a line fisherman for rock bass, which we would sell to usually to the Hotel DuPont. Um, Following that, I had the opportunity to go to university. I went to the University of Delaware and I studied the fishing communities that I love so much. So Port Penn, uh, Delaware City, and the fishing communities all the way down to Lewis and I guess, my maternal fourth great grandmother's house.
Wow.
So that's how I got started, and then I did a variety of very important projects in aquaculture. I had the great good fortune of meeting a number of luminaries, both in sociology and aquaculture, and developed uh, a, a new branch of science with some of them. Um, in, we had initially termed it marine or ocean sociology, where we studied the life of people living in maritime conditions, fishermen, and people in professions aligned with fishermen, from chefs all the way to the painters of boats and to haulers. So it was a very rewarding time. Um, In 1993, I received a fellowship from the University of Delaware to study collections at the Smithsonian, at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, at Tulane, and in other regions that are all related to fisheries. And I studied the indigenous fishing techniques, both in Delaware and in other parts of the region around the world, in particular in the Western Hemisphere at that time. In 2008, I came to China for the first time, and I worked for the Sustainable Development Commission in Shanghai to begin to help with the Shanghai World Expo and design portions of pavilions and portions of buildings that would be able to withstand earthquakes and look at other things. And I have a way of looking at both science and marine science that encourages what's called passive conservation. That's conservation essentially through not altering the environment once you've already altered it. So if you build a building close to the water, leave the structure underneath the building alone, except for making minor repairs to ensure its stability, and then let the marine life grow on it, and turn the bottoms of buildings into mussel dens where possible. And we proved that with a project that I worked on in Delaware at the Milton Library, where piles were driven into the water uh, by the edge of a small river, which has freshwater mussels, so that the mussels acted as kind of a natural glue, supporting the structure of the building. And that was the first time I really began to develop this idea of passive conservation, that nature would be able to repair human structures and develop biodiversity around human structures.
My goodness, that's fascinating.
So that's where I got my start. Following that, I I finished my graduate degrees and I was appointed as a professor at Ocean University of China. And during my time at Ocean University of China, it was almost 6 years. I primarily worked with graduate students, giving lectures on the development of the sea and civilization, and which is the name also of a wonderful book I'd like to recommend to your audience, and developing systems and structures for the preservation of biodiversity areas, looking at marine protected areas as a tool to create overspill um, of selected species of migratory fish. And it was something I wanted to put into practice, that the environment can be restored by this combination of both having regulated fishing, marine protected areas, and structures that would be um, or that could act as a buttress for developing these little islands of biodiversity. Whether it would be with oysters, for example, we use the Pacific oyster as one example, or whether it would be with seaweeds, and we used a part of a region of Qingdao called Laoshan as an example for seaweeds. We noticed the wildlife returns within 2 to 3 years. So you begin to see a return within 2 to 3 years and a change in the natural environment. Biodiversity increases and the number of species also increases. So the total density of, for example, anglerfish, sea cucumbers, and other animals in the wild all begin to increase pretty dramatically. Then I had the opportunity to spend 2 years, 2 lovely years in Palau, doing very similar work and also helping them restore multi-species hatchery. And just last year, I had the opportunity to return to Qingdao with my wife.
You obviously enjoy life there.
Well, we do. We live a very simple life here. We live a very modest life here. My work is primarily focused on conducting that research, and I tend to live in a very modest way. My favorite activity is always to go out fishing when I can.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. You've spent years researching fisheries policy in China and working directly with fishing communities. What does the West most consistently get wrong about China's fisheries?
Well, that it's monolithic. That there's one monolithic fishing industry in China, which is completely incorrect. So, for example, here in Qingdao, they have a bitter rivalry with the next city over, Weifang, for who can have the best fishermen, who can have the best fishing fleet. And it's something that they have to negotiate every year. Yantai, on the other hand, has a bitter rivalry with other states in the region and also with Qingdao for who has the best rights to fisheries in the Yellow Sea fishing region. So the idea that fisheries are monolithic entities in China is completely incorrect. They're not monolithic at all. In fact, they're as filled with rivalries as Western fisheries are. The difference is that they're more focused on production. So in Qingdao, all of the fisheries are certified for local production. So there is no problem with illegal, unregulated, or underreported fishing from Qingdao. And that's a policy that my students help put into effect. Um, and it's one of the high points of policy for Qingdao that it leads the majority of Chinese fishing in having the most ethical fishery of them all. It could actually set standards even for some member countries of the European Union, Spain in particular. Um, Spain has a problem with illegal or underreported fishing and sometimes turning off the transponders. In Qingdao, you don't have that problem. The fishermen are required to keep them on both by the Chinese government and by the international community and by the regional fisheries organization where if they go out deep sea fishing. So they generally are well educated and follow the law. We also have in Qingdao a fisheries moratorium period for the region to allow the regional fishery just in the area around Qingdao to recover every year. And there's a misconception, I believe, in the West that China is just fished out. They've caught all the fish that are close to their shore. There's very little left, and it's an environmental catastrophe. This is a story I hear frequently at conferences and meetings. But in Qingdao and to the north in the Bohai Sea, that's simply not true. What they've done is they've replaced a lot of the maritime fishery with aquaculture. So out of a city of approximately, today it's 9 million people, um, about 1.2 million people work in the maritime industries in Qingdao. Of that 1.2 million people, about 500,000 are engaged in aquaculture. And Qingdao is the reason why aquaculture makes up 60% of Chinese seafood development. The graduates from Ocean University of China and from the other prestigious schools like the Nanjing Agricultural University um, have created both a freshwater fishery for one group and a marine fishery for the Ocean University system that is almost unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And for me, it was a real honor to be able to work with the students from those groups. They've created an aquaculture system that controls about 60% of total global market share. And increasingly, for the last now 8 years, they've worked on increasing the standards for aquaculture, reducing the antibiotic load, reducing the use of banned antibiotics in the West, and developing more natural and natural biological communities um, for um, fisheries. They were one of the pioneers. The Yellow Sea Fishery Laboratory under Ma Jun was one of the pioneers in developing and genetically modifying the European turbot. So one of the most common fish here is actually the European turbot. And turbot are the primary fish that the people of Qingdao buy and think of as their native fish because Ma Jun was a pioneering female scientist. She genetically altered them to be able to survive, thrive, and grow much, much larger than they normally would in the waters here.
That's interesting now.
So those are all some of the basic misconceptions about fisheries, at least for Qingdao. Now, other regions in China follow different rules. And because other regions follow different rules, you find that there's such a plurality of laws and regulations that it's quite chaotic. You have, for example, squid fishermen who are sailing from Guangdong, who have nothing to do with regulations that are applicable to fishermen from Qingdao. You'll have occasionally illegal fishing taking place from different areas that have nothing to do with the way fisheries are regulated in Qingdao. So this creates the idea that there's, again, we just see it as a monolithic number in FAO reports or World Food Program reports, that there's all of this destructive fishing taking place. And in some regions, that's true. It is. In Qingdao, on the other hand, it's not true. They have one of the strongest regulatory frameworks for fishing in the world, and it's one of the most effective. One of the things that's always impressed me is they developed both Ocean Farm 1 and Ocean Farm 2 that are currently growing Norwegian salmon not too far away from you, or not too far away from the Shetlands.
Okay. Wow. And when you talk about the different regions and that and the fishery and that no I you use, is there any relation and arrangements with other countries? So is there any other countries fishing in the waters of China?
Occasionally there will be. So they, in the past, they had arrangements for the South, but I'm not really as familiar with any of those as I am with the conditions around Shandong and in the Bohai Sea. So, for example, in the Bohai Sea, they have a fishing arrangement with both South Korea and North Korea, where portions of the Bohai Sea are used by both countries, one for food security and one for market access. And we had an interesting incident uh, while I was working here on the Yellow Sea fishery, where we had a submarine from an unspecified, a very small submarine from an unspecified neighbor crash into the aquaculture cages, releasing a number of fish into the ocean, which the fishermen were very happy to pick up, but the Coast Guard was very displeased for a while.
Gee. And did they ever find out where it came from?
Yes, of course. But it would be improper for me to
Okay.
say.
Start on. We're not wanting to start an international incident on our recording. No, that's fascinating. Is there any moment where you realize Chinese fisheries policy was more effective or different than Western observers imagine?
In Qingdao, I did. My students and I had worked on port state measures, so that port state measures could be implemented throughout Qingdao. Qingdao, because it has a number of deep water ports and because it is a main area for fishing activity in the north, um, needed to regulate the kinds of flag ships that were coming into its ports, and it had never done so before. So we actually won an award from Tsinghua University. My students did for proposing a system of port state and flagging measures for the ships. And it was quite an honor to be part of that and to work with students on developing that. What it wound up doing, though, when it was translated into policy, was it created a system that was as efficient as that of Norway in terms of its health, safety, and environmental regulations for fishing boats. The government subsidized also many new fishing boats while preserving the wooden and traditional fishing boats. So you have two fisheries operating simultaneously in Qingdao. You have a traditional fishery that operates primarily in between the seaweed lines, and there are thousands of acres of seaweed growing. And you have wooden boats that are fill the entire area. They're quite distinctive and quite unique. And they represent the traditional fishing boats. And then you have modern fishing boats, self-built, domestically, for the most part, domestically built. One was donated either by Norway or Sweden. The rest are all domestically built that operate as a fishing fleet for the villages in Qingdao. And they're extremely effective in the Yellow Sea for the aquaculture haul. So annually during harvest season, there'll be an aquaculture haul of several different varieties of fish. Most of that will be brought back to the mainland. And the villagers celebrate the traditional festivals surrounding that.
Okay. How was the Chinese fisheries moratorium actually implemented on the ground?
So on the ground, there's in Qingdao, there's a system of game wardens, and the Qingdao Municipal Fishery Bureau sends out game wardens and the Coast Guard to make sure that it's implemented. It's very efficient. It's one of the most efficient, actually, uses of a fishing moratorium that I've seen in my lifetime. It's much more effective than the fisheries moratoriums that have been put in place in the United States. And it's been much more effective than fisheries moratoriums that have been put in place in neighboring countries like South Korea and Japan. So that part has actually been extremely successful. The area where they do struggle is maintaining the shoreline and the coastal biodiversity has been much more difficult. And in part, that's not due to overfishing, it's due to pollution. There were a number of paper mills that were hastily built following World War II. Those paper mills let out tremendous amounts of pollution into the Qingdao Bay. That pollution was slowly eroding the bay, and Ocean University of China, I had the pleasure of participating in this, developed the oyster and reclamation program, where essentially students were encouraged to build a great wall of oysters, where the level 1 of oysters would absorb all of the toxins. Level 2 of the oysters would begin the process of filtering the water. Level 3 of the oysters would begin uh, essentially developing oysters that could be harvested. Level 4, 5, 6 of the oysters over 6 years began to clean up much of that pollution naturally. And it followed that idea of that I had been working on. So um, of passive conservation of biodiversity. We found that if you let nature clean itself using the large oysters here, within 6 trial generations, you begin to see a noticeable difference in the amount of heavy metal, the acidity of the water, the lead. Things began to normalize. And by the end of the 6th generation, things were pretty much, um, and still are, much better than they are in other regions along the coast of China.
So you're working with Mother Nature rather than against her.
Yes. So the idea was that if you work with Mother Nature, anything is possible. If you use the specific function of an animal to do what it does best in nature, you can create natural abundance over a period of time. The thing is that it doesn't give the same kind of economic returns that a normal investment would usually demand for a blue economy. They would say, a normal investment would say, we want a return on investment as soon as the first batch are ready. The first batch are polluted. Obviously, people wouldn't be able to eat them. So you have to wait. You have to give nature time to be able to clear out all of the pollutants that have entered the water. The same thing was true with sea cucumbers, where we found that uh, the more sea cucumber larvae that we released into the water, the cleaner the sand and the cleaner the bottom became. The more we tried to control surface water temperatures, the fewer outbreaks of the algae on the surface became. The larger outbreaks of, or where we had a particularly hot summer, people were encouraged to harvest the sea lettuce, find a use for it, eat it, turn it into something productive. The same thing was true with jellyfish. When we had swarms of jellyfish, they became dried jellyfish that you could turn into salads, adding necessary micronutrients to people's diets. So it's actually quite a well structured and well thought out system of renewable growth and reuse. And my foundational idea of that passive ecology um, is one that could transform communities, I believe, all around the world. If you essentially put into effect um, temporary moratoriums in areas where they're needed, but allow fishermen to do what they do best, which is fish but not overfish, um, you can allow nature to heal itself over time. As nature begins to heal itself, um, the biodiversity that the fishermen want, so that they want to fish as much as possible, begins to return, but it doesn't return immediately. So, for an average fish species here, say we've imported the black bass, which is a hybrid from South America. But they don't consider it an invasive species. They consider it a locally introduced species. Um, Fishermen now are able to harvest as much as they want because we decided that the way to encourage their growth would be to grow kilometer after kilometer of seaweed. So there was so much seaweed being grown at one point in Qingdao to be shipped to South Korea. It changed the water current.
Wow. And what does that look like for a fisherman in Qingdao?
So for the villagers in Qingdao, they've grown rich. The village community divides seafood up in a very different way. So while fishing may be competitive, in order to get fish logistically to the seafood market at 3 a.m. every morning, after the fishermen go out, usually for the night, they bring the haul back and a middleman will purchase the seafood. The seafood will then be hauled to the seafood market at 3 a.m. and it'll be sold to bidders from the region. The bidders from the region can then load the seafood into refrigerated containers, either in trucks or on the high speed rail, and have it to anywhere within the Shandong Peninsula within 4 hours of being caught. So, for the average fishing family, they've been able to buy refrigerators, BMWs.
Okay. Yeah,
It's
so
actually it's quite a joy for me to see how that very simple change led to greater not only prosperity but an economic sense of um, greater security for the individual families.
yeah, and if the fisherman, if he wasn't fishing there, where did the effort go instead?
Fishing has been taking place in Qingdao for over 12,000 years. So the fishing communities that are here, the modern ones, have merely upgraded that technology and they have a very comprehensive educational strategy so that even fishermen from villages know that fishing can take place in essentially three ways. Um, During seasons that are open, you can do as much offshore fishing as you want. During seasons that are closed, you can do as much aquaculture as you want. During seasons when it's harvest, you harvest from the Yellow Sea. And the Yellow Sea has become a breadbasket for large parts of northeastern China.
Just my head when you speak about China, but it's interesting listening to you, Richard, because I just always see it so vast, but your thoughts are very much in regions. You're not ever
Yeah,
talking about China as
no, you can't talk about China monolithically in terms of fisheries because it's so diverse. So, for example, in near Shanghai, there's a lake, and in that lake they grow hairy clawed crabs, which are a specialty. Okay, those crabs only grow in that lake. Try as you might to get them to grow in aquaculture, try as you might to get them to grow in RAS systems, try as you might to get them to grow in other lakes. No, they'll only grow in that lake. So it's impossible to talk about China as a monolithic whole in terms of fisheries. Um, there, for example, in there's a gentleman I work with in Western China. He has the largest sturgeon farms in the world. And not many people know this, but the largest amount of caviar in on the planet is produced here in China. It's not produced in Russia. It's not produced in Iran. It's not produced in the Caspian Sea. It's not produced in the Black Sea anymore, for sure. But it's produced in the western lakes of China.
okay. When you talk about lakes and that lake you talked earlier about with the crab, are they freshwater or sea water?
They're freshwater, freshwater. Yeah. So you have this huge diversity um, of riverine fisheries, lake fisheries, tidal fisheries, and marine fisheries that extend a border as long as that of the United States.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. Did the moratorium lead to real behavioral change or mostly displaced effort elsewhere?
No, I think it depends on the region. So in Qingdao, we can see that it led to real behavioral change. It led to the growth of aquaculture. So in Guangdong and in Qingdao, you both see that aquaculture is taking off. The majority of the aquaculture products that are produced there it's about 60% of the total global aquaculture in the world. And those are both with the assistance of the students and researchers from Ocean University of China. That's an impressive number. And it's fundamentally changed the way aquaculture is conducted around the world. It's not always given enough credit for doing that. On the other hand, um, in some regions, um, and I'm thinking of one in particular, in Zhejiang in particular, it may have displaced fishermen who just engaged in other efforts. Um, Maybe they even left fishing. Some of them left fishing and went into something else. Um, so you see that there is a huge variety of consequences by having seasonal moratorium periods. Each province is in control of its own moratorium period. And because each province is in control of its own moratorium period, to an outsider, it look sometimes it'll look like chaos. You'll say, "Oh, we were just fishing on this side, but we're not allowed to fish on this side." So with when we look at fisheries in China as a whole, it has to be divided into the individual region. And many times it even has to be further subdivided into the individual county or township. For example, Qingdao has its own fisheries ministry that's as large as the entire UK fisheries ministry.
Wow. But it's on its own.
Yeah, of its own.
So a lot of things are regional rather than national.
They have to be. They have to be because the country is so large. So imagine the manpower that it takes to regulate, support, and assist approximately 1.2 million people working in different fisheries occupations, all the way from the local fishmonger to the fishing restaurant to the fishing boats to the shipping mechanics to the able-bodied seamen to the captains to the licensed river fisheries to the aquaculturists. So this takes a huge administrative complex.
Yeah, it's that will be that there would be better decisions made when it's made in the region itself rather than nationally. Even a small country like UK or Scotland, we find that when they regionalise things and take it away from local, it's we can see the disadvantage very
Yeah,
quick.
this is one of the concerns that I've always had for Scotland, and it's part of the reason why I was hoping to come to Scotland at some point. Scottish fisheries have gone through a number of scandals. And the scandals boil down to essentially national control of fisheries policy. The greater regional control there is of, in particular, aquaculture policy, um, the less problems arise. But neither Scotland nor Wales nor Northern Ireland have ever had their own independent fisheries policy. They do to a certain extent, but it's very limited. And in comparison to China, it's minuscule. So, for example, Qingdao was able to adopt a fisheries policy based on Sweden and Norway about 40 years ago, modify it to local conditions, and add ideas that are distinctively Chinese to it. And by doing so, it transformed the way fisheries operate here. So that aquaculture is not seen in an oppositional way as it is often seen in the West. It's seen as part of the natural environment, support to economic development, and a public support to boardwalks, lights, roads, subsidies for medicines and for old age.
Top-down policy is often criticized in the West. In Chinese fisheries, is it a weakness or sometimes an advantage?
It's both. So the Chinese don't look at it in the same way that we do. We would look at, for example, the regionalization of policy is it needs a central control. There is a central control, but the central control is not as top down as we like to make it appear. Normally, it's coming from the bottom up and developing best practices that can then be translated into other regions. But those regions have to have certain conditions. For example, they have to be similar climatically. China contains regions all the way from regions in the tropics, like Hainan Island, which is at about the same latitude as Hawaii, to regions that are closer to the Arctic in the Bohai Sea and on the edge of Mongolia, where it gets to minus 52 degrees, I believe was the weather yesterday morning on the eastern edge of Mongolia. So the extensive lake systems there are all regulated as part of Chinese fisheries, and the extensive ocean fisheries in tropical regions are all regulated as part of Chinese fisheries. So how do you develop one policy for that many climatic zones? It would simply be impossible. So you have to develop regional policies that support regional growth and regional development. They are unified in the idea that science and the progress that science brings can bring prosperity. And if it's done in harmony with nature, it doesn't have to bring the destructive effects that we've often seen. So, one of the reasons why sea lice have been such a problem in the Atlantic Ocean is the constant use of lights and lighting. So, you'll notice that in the Pacific region, no lights, no lighting, and also very, very, very few outbreaks of sea lice or other fish diseases. Vibrio is the most common disease, and it primarily affects shellfish.
Who benefits most, the state, industry, or fishing families?
It's both. So the villagers typically are part of what we would consider a communal structure. So the villagers in ecological communities who run the fisheries are part of communal structures. Those communal structures will sit around, debate, and decide different policies. They'll plant seedlings that they get from the state or from the universities. They'll try different things, they'll experiment with different things, and they'll look at what works best for their individual community. What makes their individual community the largest amount of revenue? And every year they audit these communities and then divvy up a harvest sum so that it operates quite differently from Western Fisheries Corporation. The other thing is that many of the activities, especially the traditional fishing activities, are subsidized by the government because they want to preserve their traditional fishery. They want to show the world that there is an active and traditional fishery, while at the same time, the modern fishery is able to support itself through a single harvest season.
I know this is maybe hypothetical. If a European government tried the same, what would happen politically?
Oh no, they have. So if you go to Norway, you see in Iceland, you see a very similar system to the system that they use here in Qingdao. So Norway and Iceland were Norway, Iceland, and Sweden were the original models for how Qingdao would conduct its fisheries policy. And I believe it was in the 1970s. I believe it started in 1976 that they began a partnership program with salmon, with turbot, and with other hardy north fish. But they also began a policy program that mirrored the Nordic countries. Now, a lot of the policy that the Nordic countries have dropped today is still preserved in law in Qingdao, which is quite interesting.
Okay, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, so there was a time when villages in Norway would be essentially collective fishing collectives. That's no longer the case. Usually, they're a fishing corporation that operates in some ways like a collective, but only through taxation. But not here. It still operates as a collective. It still operates as a fishing collective, very much like Norway had in the 1970s.
Yeah. If I go on, how does Chinese compliance compare to Europe and North America in reality?
So, compliance primarily in Qingdao has been quite dynamic and quite good. Fishermen haven't always agreed with it. There have been many policies that have been made. When the fishing moratorium was first enacted, there were many fishermen who were against it. But over the course of approximately 3 years, they came to see that after the end of 3 years, their benefits were so much higher by following the fisheries moratorium that it made sense to be compliant with the regulations that were coming out. Prior to that, though, there had been back and forth and debates about how it should be implemented. And one of the things that Qingdao did that I don't know if or how many other communities in China have done is they sent a majority of their young scientists to institutions like Auburn University, to Edinburgh, to work at Scottish fishing farms or to work at English fishing farms or to work in fishing farms in Norway or with Sweden, and to develop the necessary skills to be able to bring back here and to implement them in their own unique way. So you can drive to a village And you'll see techniques that are from, the school of German fisheries. You can drive to another village and you'll see techniques that are unique to a school of Scandinavian fisheries. And I find that absolutely fascinating.
Indeed, that's for sure. And moving on, so you worked with China's blue granary concept at the community level. What does it really mean beyond the press releases?
Well, when you get past the press releases are all about developing abundance, and it has done that. But what it's also done is it's developed entire industries. So, for example, the industry for artificial fishery cages and the development of offshore aquaculture. The idea of offshore aquaculture as a granary for specific species of fish and a ranch for other species of fish. So, mackerel, which are tenaciously hard to farm, have been or are being farmed here. And the way that they farm them is through essentially giant raceway fishing branches in the Yellow Sea. Um, Turbot, which traditionally had been, bottom dwelling flatfish, are allowed to be bottom dwelling flatfish, but they're harvested from giant pens that are set in the Yellow Sea. So most of it is developing cage fishery from very hardy broodstock that's grown in laboratory conditions on land. And that's a big difference. One of the things um, that it was advertised as was that it would be completely natural. Well, that's not completely correct. So there had been a number of changes in the stock or the fish stock and the brood stock over time, both through natural selection and through genetic modification, to make them hardier for the waters that are here. Um, and by doing that, they're able to create a superabundance of virtually the most popular fish in the region.
That's really interesting. Integrated multi-trophic aquaculture is widely praised. Where did it genuinely work and where did it face cultural or economic resistance?
Okay, so it's faced um, resistance almost everywhere, and it's faced acceptance in many places. So if we look at, for example, in the Pacific Islands, um, Palau has desperately wanted to try to start integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. But the capacity to actually have that and have logistics chains set up to accommodate it have been very difficult to create. The same thing is true in the Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands. The same thing is true to a certain extent, in Guam and in the Northern Mariana Islands. It works better in Japan, where you have more logistics networks that are set up to accommodate many different species being harvested at once. A great example is that it works wonderfully well here in Qingdao, um, and just to the south of us, in another community, Rizhao, it doesn't work nearly as well because not just because of the logistics, but also because of the way the peninsula curves. So Rizhao is called the Sunshine City. It gets more sun than anywhere else. It should have a stronger fishery than it does, but there are a number of different economic and political reasons that it doesn't. So Virtually everywhere that it's been tried, it works to some extent. The level to which it works varies from one place to another. And in the areas that I've studied in Asia, the two that really stand out, or actually three that really stand out as superstars in pioneering diversified, integrated, multi-trophic aquaculture are here in Qingdao, um, in Weihai, also, but then also in South Korea and in parts of South Korea and in parts of Japan. So those three regions tend to have a very sophisticated educational system that has really trained the farmers how to do this. Um, the other regions, um, usually what they're missing primarily is the policy that enables it to really take place and really begin to grow. Um, the same thing is true in many Western countries. Many Western countries view integrated multi-trophic aquaculture as an experimental phase right now, but some have actually begun to apply it, and it works just fine because they have the logistics and the policy set up for it to work. And others have tried it, and it's been not as successful. So, for example, for many years, Canada has tried to have it, and they've had a number of uh, uh, issues, from public backlash toward it, toward misunderstandings within democratic councils toward it, and the I think the overall public education is not as strong, or hasn't been as strong in those areas, in the same way that it hasn't been as strong in the tropical areas here in China. So integrated multi-trophic aquaculture could work in all of the tropical areas uh, of Hong Kong and Hainan Island and these other regions, but it's never really been done.
And when you say Western governments and communities, are they capable of adopting similar approaches?
Yes, absolutely. They just need to vote. You would just need to vote on it. Essentially, it just takes policy changes to change the logistics network. So we often forget that we and I used to walk by Adam Smith's picture every day, and I would look at him and I would say, Adam, they've forgotten everything you taught them, because Adam Smith wrote his first treatise on political economy. We forget that the economy is also a political entity. Um, Economics stands alone. The market decides. We often say that. But economics doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists in a political economy. So if you have enough votes for anything, you can find a way to make it work. And one of the genius measures of Adam Smith was pointing that out very early on. I believe it was 1769. He pointed out that if politics were to be favorable, um, virtually any innovative process in economy could be accomplished. So if China didn't have aquaculture, let's say there was no aquaculture in China, there would not be enough fish to feed China fish. It's only because of aquaculture that fishing has been widely distributed around the region. Aquaculture has formed a bridge that allows wild fishing to take place at an acceptable level to the world community by the different regions of China and the different Chinese corporations. Because aquaculture is increasing, at some point, I anticipate that wild caught fisheries from China will disappear. They won't exist anymore. As long as aquaculture continues on the trajectory it's on right now, within the next 20 years, China will be fully self-sufficient in aquaculture. But no, if China continues on this trajectory that it's on now, aquaculture will be the replacement for wild caught fisheries within 30 years.
Who would first feel the pinch? Fishermen in China or consumers in Europe or developing nations?
Well, my hope is that if we transition to fully aquaculture based economy, nobody will have to feel the pinch. That there is more than enough technical capacity and technology to develop systems all around the world that can produce the same kind of superabundance that we have in Qingdao of fish and seafood to every other region of the world. It's a model that can be exported, but has to be adapted locally and has to be, willingly accepted by fishermen. Fishermen have to be retrained to be aquaculturists. Not all fishermen are willing to do that. So um, that that division, I believe, is going to take some time. There was a campaign for a long time in many Western countries where they were saying it's genetically modified salmon or genetically modified seafood. But here, none of the seafood is necessarily genetically modified, other than to withstand cold weather, um, and usually through natural selection. Um, Natural selection is the genetic modification. So I think that model is one that can be replicated in almost any environment. So if we didn't have aquaculture, though, playing such a preponderant role, seafood would be, again, the purview of the Chinese elite and only the Chinese elite.
Uh, can you give an example from the Qingdao market that illustrates this dynamic?
Okay, so um, the Qingdao market right now, and I'll just talk about the market that's down the street from my house. The Qingdao market down the street from my house right now has more seafood in it than the entire northern Scottish seafood industry produces in a day. Yeah, so if you estimate that the northern Scottish seafood industry is producing approximately 2 to 3 tons a day, that's about how much our single seafood market has, because it's feeding a vastly larger number of people. And seafood makes up such an integral part of the diet of the native people here. So for the native Qingdao people here, they would never give up seafood. Um, Even if they had to catch it wildly, they would develop farms for seafood. They would not go back to not eating seafood. They have, and we showed it very clearly. They have over 9,000 years from an archaic period in Qingdao's history of a large-scale harvest of oysters, shellfish, uh, and even deep sea fish. So they would not go back to a diet without seafood. It's a part of the diet every single day.
Yeah. The the West is, I'm to say in general, the West is massively dependent on the China market. Richard, I see it around the UK. On a recent podcast with a guy, Greg Mercer, around the maritime states in Canada, and
Mhm.
his it was about his book, The Lobster Trap.
Yeah.
It emphasized it further, and the China market has become massive.
Yes. So the import export market is a different issue. When we get to the import export market, virtually every Western seafood company that I've had the pleasure to work with um, has been incredibly dependent on selling their seafood, their salmon, their lobsters, uh, their Dungeness crabs, their gooey ducks, all to markets here in China. And the majority of it comes here to Qingdao. I see Canadian gooey duck in Qingdao markets every day.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've seen me standing on our local harbour, Richard, as just say crabbers are landing, and they'll just within the conversation they'll say, "Oh, we've got a good price today. The quality is good, and it's going to China."
Yeah, they ship much of it to China, which is unfortunate because is based on the idea that the local market economies can't support themselves, which isn't true. So one of the ways to kind of sidestep the trap would be to encourage Chinese self-sufficiency in those products through aquaculture. So if the Chinese were self-sufficient, maybe Scotland, for example, would lose a crabbing market, but Scotland could develop its own crabbing market for its own purposes, for its own people. Um, and it would have to take, I know this is an unpopular position, but it would have to take somewhat of a more nationalist approach toward the development of its own seafood industry.
Uh huh. But when I talk about that, I'm talking more about the any market. You get your bigger, you get a higher price, and depending on what market your your product r- reaches. And
Yeah,
now,
yeah, and you'll find that.
where we used to maybe find exporting our mark, I can remember when I was younger and my father was fishing. If they were exported, that would be to maybe France or Spain or that, and that would maybe be a better market. And I was fascinated listening to Greg Mercer in the Maritime States in Canada, where the top market for their lobster
Yeah,
used to be America. The China market is taking over that.
absolutely, absolutely. And so if I walk down the street and I walk in, they have spiny lobster from the Pacific states in tropical cages. They have, let's see, they have the Australian lobsters, and they have Canadian lobsters in larger tanks. And the prices are phenomenal. It's more than the average person makes in 2 years. So if we take an average fisherman and fishing family here, and we take their entire salary for 2 years, that's the price of one large Canadian lobster. Yeah. So these are for really high-end clients. And what my students found was that the import products, the products that are coming in, are primarily reserved for those high net worth individuals in China. They're generally not sold to the local population. The local population continues to eat the local seafood that's grown locally and developed locally. Um, all of the imported lobster or giant freshwater prawns or the Canadian lobster or others, whether they're from the United States, whether they're from St. Pierre, or whether they're from any of the Maritimes in Nova Scotia, whether they're from Norway or the European Union with salmon, um, or whether they're from companies in your backyard. The Scottish Seafood Association also had a number of fish that it was selling here a long time ago. Um, they were all geared toward the Chinese elite. So those are all products that are being purchased by extremely high net worth individuals here. The farming families, the common families, family like mine, where the majority of people are fishermen, no, no. They eat local food. So they're somewhat detached from that market. What they do see is they see the people who own finance businesses driving to the local seafood market and then purchasing those. And they'll be purchasing them to impress clients from Southeast Asia or from other places. So they're considered status symbols much more than they're considered symbols of nutrition. And that leads to something of a very difficult problem for the states that are involved in exporting them. You get a phenomenal price exporting them, but do they go to food security? No. Do they go to the general population? No. And how they're used and how they're consumed. While it may be excellent for the salesperson, it's extremely difficult to imagine a normal Chinese family ever being able to afford any of that. That's all a direct result in their minds of they call it the byproduct of globalization. They say the byproduct of globalization is we have lobsters from Canada, but we can never eat them. We don't even know what they're like.
Yeah. I don't think that's
We
restricted.
don't even have an imagination of what they're like. So um, they discuss this as being a limitation on their ability to buy more affordable seafood.
Yeah, but when you mention status symbol and things like that, Richard, that's not restricted to China.
Mhm. Absolutely not. So you would see the same thing in the United States to a certain extent, especially for older and larger lobsters. You would see the same thing in the United States for older and larger salmon, and you would see the same thing for smoked salmon. All of those products serve as status symbols in a variety of different countries. It's just how much the individual is willing to pay for them. So seafood has always been attracted to where capital lies. So whoever provides the highest price is usually the winning bidder on a batch of seafood.
Well, when you say the winning bidder, that's the way the China market is looked at in this country now, Richard, with, say, for instance, that's a brown, we call it the brown edible crab, European
Mm.
crab, or the Atlantic lobster, or that. It's almost like it's reaching, if it makes grade goes to the China market, it's almost classed as a standard now, and that's where the fishermen get the best price.
Right. The key to making sure that that doesn't become a dependency, though, is ensuring that you maintain open markets with everyone in that, so that uh, there could come a day when Scotland or the UK make decisions that would threaten the market with for the purchase of those. The key to ensuring that it doesn't become a political trap is making sure that you have another client state that can bid for it on a similar basis. Um, and usually that has traditionally been the United States. In the future, I I hope it still will be, but I'm not sure.
They did have issues in this country where, well, this country meaning the UK, where for one time the China market stopped buying
Mm,
UK lobsters, and they said it was a problem with the water,
uh-huh.
an infestation, and there was a Dutch company buying the lobster in this country and sending them to China, and they were okay. So
Yeah, they're okay with that. Yeah.
it makes you realize the last thing we want to do with our fishing industry is to take politics into it.
No, 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 no. So one of the things that is common in dealing with mega markets is that you'll find that all mega markets are politicized markets. This is part of the reason why, for throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there was a considerable amount of both, you know, in a way, affection and also resentment toward the United States. The same thing is true with the Chinese market, because any mega market anywhere in the world is going to be a political market. And they're going to use that political clout whenever there's a dispute to strike at a vulnerable industry. So traditionally in societies, there have been no more vulnerable industries than coastal industries. Coastal industries are always the most vulnerable. So the question I believe all of the Western nations need to ask themselves is, how do we strengthen our own domestic consumption of these products? How do we find another political partner to work with, another rival mega state to work with, be it the United States or the European Union? And how do we ensure that the supply is maintained, even if the price has to fluctuate from time to time? So that that way you can maintain a sense of political independence in decision making. And this has always been a problem for Scotland in particular. Scotland has always encountered this problem because of its relationship with the United Kingdom.
I don't think it's a bad relationship. Well, it is a relationship. We're seen as one, apart
Yeah,
from.
it's of course, it's a marriage relationship, but there are elements, for example, the Scottish National Party, for one, who have had policies that are very much at odds with the United Kingdom, with the rest of the United Kingdom, and that will sometimes create friction with other states and so on and so forth. So to maintain some sense of autonomy, one of the most important things for coastal communities to do is to make sure that they have a basket of partners that they can trade with. It's having a diversified export market. So that export market could be Canada, can be the United States, can be the European Union. And, oftentimes, though, when you're dealing with the European Union, they turn around and, like you said with the Netherlands, they'll act as middlemen and they'll just sell product back to China for a higher price, for a much higher price. Um, Usually, you don't find that same problem with either the United States or with Canada. They're usually going to have the domestic consumption or domestic demand to be able to absorb that, and that's traditionally been the case.
Yeah. Is meaningful fisheries cooperation between China and the West realistic?
I think in the future it will be. As standards become more uniform around the world, I think that it could be. I think at the moment it would be unrealistic. There are enough policy disagreements in many, many areas that it would take a while for both China to explain itself to the West and for the West to be able to accept that the Chinese approach things quite differently than they do. So until those larger disagreements, those larger arrangements are made, I think you need to have a more structured trading system, whether it's by treaty or whether it's by quota or whether it's by development, through natural development of import and export markets. But it has to be regulated in such a way so that it doesn't wind up having such a deleterious impact on the export economy. So if the export economy is only dependent on China and China stops all trade, you go to a middleman, right? Like the Netherlands. But does that benefit fishermen in Scotland?
Well, it usually benefits the middleman.
Exactly. So what you want to do in this case again is you want to create policies at the national level that benefit the individual fishermen because the coastal communities historically have been the most vulnerable. Now China has all these policies developed for its own citizens. And China looks at the West and wonders why don't they protect their people? And this is a question, it's a valid question. And when I've heard the Chinese officials, they've asked me this, and they've said, why don't they protect their own people? Don't they understand that this is a national resource? I don't have a good answer for them.
No, it's a valid point.
I've told them quite frankly, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know how to answer that. Because what I've noticed is that the coastal communities are typically the most vulnerable communities within every state that I've ever lived in or visited.
Yeah, I don't think that. I've just wondered if there is an answer. They're right.
Well, they are right. But when I asked them, where did you get this idea from? Where did this idea come from? Well, it didn't develop in a vacuum. Part of it is Chinese protectionism. Part of it, though, came from our protectionism of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. So it's a mixture between the two. During a period when we had protected industries, um, China was very interested in the way that we did that. And in particular, they were interested in the United Kingdom, they were interested in the Scandinavian countries. They looked at Scotland, they looked at Alaska, they looked at these other places, and they said, they have protected fisheries. They're able to thrive. Why can't we? Well, then they looked through their history and they found in the past we did have protected fisheries. So they used a model from their own past, and then they combined it with the model that we had been using until I guess, the 1980s. During the 1980s, much of that was dismantled.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Mm.
Fascinating. Where do Western scientists and policymakers talk past Chinese counterparts, even when they think they're collaborating?
They don't understand each other. So there are fundamental disagreements on not just fisheries, but a variety of different issues where Chinese language is much different. And I always use the analogy that the Chinese language is we can do both and we can do something else. Where Western policy decisions have typically been made, it's either we do this or we do that. So we miss the point of each other's statements and sentiments when we move in that direction. The minute you begin to realize that anything being said in the Chinese policy realm for seafood is, yes, we're going to do that, but we would also like to do more and more and more and more. It's meant to develop this long term relationship. Now, how that relationship plays out is dependent on how the other side plays the relationship. So if the other side approaches the relationship as, yes, we'll do that, very short term, right? Then they're only going to get a short term return. If they play it as an either or relationship, they'll get either a long term return or a long term loss. But if they play it as a long term relationship and say, yes, we understand that you want that, and we're willing to give it to you, but we also need this in return, it becomes much more of a mutual discussion about interest. And that is often in the world of seafood, where Chinese and their Western counterparts um, talk over each other and really don't understand each other.
Yeah, no, that's very valid. If you were designing a China, say, EU fisheries dialogue from scratch, what would you strip out immediately?
So the first thing I would strip out immediately is any idea that it would be a free exchange. For example, we have an idea that free trade can solve all problems. But when you're dealing with any political superstate, uh, they're going to be protectionist. So the United States, for much of its history, was a protectionist state. Canada, for much of the 1950s and 60s, was protectionist of its maritimes. And China is protectionist today. So I would strip out any idea that this is going to be a free exchange uh, under the normal rules that we've been operating under since the end of World War II.
What's the most uncomfortable truth about China's fishery that Western audiences don't want to hear?
That in the inland fisheries, they're not as well regulated as they should be. And some of that makes its way to Western markets. So in the lake and river fisheries, they're not as well regulated as they need to be in many places. And a lot of the catfish or other things make it to Western markets. There's also a network dealing with Southeast Asia, which is very complicated, and I don't absolutely don't know how it works, but I think Westerners would not be in agreement with many of the things that exist in Southeast Asia and that are going on there.
If sustainability is the goal, who looks more serious right now, China or the West?
So it depends. Again, this is a regional economy. So if Western clients come to a city like Qingdao, they're going to find an extremely sophisticated fishery mechanism, extremely sophisticated fisheries law that exceeds Western laws in many cases. And they're going to find an extremely sophisticated regulatory apparatus to protect it. Um, if they deal with some other provinces, they may find something completely different. So I think that fundamental realization of how regionalized the market is and how regionalized it's controlled um, will or should, in some way, determine the way Western companies approach the market.
Been fascinating, really is. Where can our listeners follow you online, Richard?
So I don't have much of an online presence. I have simply my LinkedIn page. They're welcome to join me to follow some of my research there. And you're welcome to link our discussion to my LinkedIn page. But if they would like more information, they're welcome to look at the Chinese Blue Economy book every year. It's published by Ocean University of China, and you can look at the Blue Economy book for China. You can also look at the World Food Program or the Food and Agriculture Organization yearly reports on the state of the world's fisheries. And you'll see either my or my students' research in that.
Excellent. Well, I would just like to thank you and thanks for this recording because I've it's been as good as everything I've been hoping it would be. And I've learned so much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Jim, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. And I think that we still have more to talk about. We have so much that we could talk about in this that um, it just blows my mind every time I listen to my colleagues in the West talk about, quote unquote, the China fishery as if it's a monolithic entity. And I realize that they're not realizing what's going on the ground here, how policy decisions are being made here. And I would like them to have some clarity on that before they begin to engage with a very large, very powerful state. It's very similar to engagement with the United States in that way. The United States, each individual state is going to have somewhat different rules for import and export and for other purposes. So I hope that they take that into consideration and that they don't wind up in the trap, the lobster trap that Greg so eloquently discussed.
Richard, you mentioned there that you felt there's more to talk about. There's still more to say. Well, my view on that is after this chat we've had, it reminds me if you just picture you've been on holiday somewhere for the first time, you've never been there before, and you just like it so much, you think about you have to go back. And it's always nice to leave some place wanting to go back. That's exactly how I feel leaving this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim. And there really is so much for us to talk about. I hope that we get the opportunity to discuss so much more in the future.
We make the opportunity, Richard. That's what we
All
do.
right. Fantastic.
That's in our capabilities in our hands. And
Yes,
my we've certainly got willing hands at my end, and you're saying the same. So we will
yep,
definitely talk again. Thank you
I
so
would love
much.
to. Of course, it's my pleasure.
Thank
Take care,
you.
Jim.